Welcome, everyone. I'm Christine Bowen, Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant. Thank you for joining us tonight for the latest installment of our In Conversation series with artists Jen Delos Reyes and Diane Borsato taking up issues around socially engaged art. This program complements our exhibition Sanatorium, currently on view, which features a transient clinic conceived by artist Pedro Reyes, no relation to Jen, which encourages interactions between visitors and dedicated volunteers in participatory therapy sessions. I would like to thank the Jack Weinbaum Family Foundation as the lead donor for this and all of our summer exhibitions, as well as the Consulate General of Mexico and support donors Elena and Jorge Soni and Marla and Larry Wasser, as well as all of the volunteers who have so generously offered their time this summer in realizing this exhibition. Finally, I would also like to acknowledge our primary education sponsor, CIBC, for their generous support of all of our education and public programs. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests. Jen Delos Reyes is an artist originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, who has exhibited widely across North America and Europe. Her research interests include the history of socially engaged art, artist-run culture, group work, band dynamics, folk music, and artist social roles. Reyes is the founder and director of Open Engagement, an international conference on socially engaged art practice, and assistant professor at Portland State University, where she teaches in the Art and Social Practice program. Diane Borsato has established a significant national reputation for works in various media, including relational and interventionist practices, performance, video, photography, and sculpture. She has exhibited and performed at institutions such as the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Power Plant, the Art Gallery of York University, the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the National Museum of Fine Arts of Quebec, among others, and in galleries internationally. Borsato is Associate Professor of Interdisciplinary Studio at the University of Guelph, where she has taught courses that explore relationships between art and everyday life. So please join me in welcoming Jen Delos Reyes and Diane Borsato.
All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm a big fan of the Power Plant, also a big fan of Diane's work, so happy to be here. And thank you all for coming and being in conversation with us this evening. Before we really get started, I just want to talk a little bit about someone who's been an inspiration for me, a little bit about open engagement, and then a lot about the format of tonight. So I have an image up here of Saul Alinsky, agitator, community organizer, overall amazing radical. And a lot of what I feel like I do in my practice is listen. I'm in this field and I'm a listener. And something that Saul Alinsky said was that most of organizing is listening. And through the work I do for the conference, I work mostly as an organizer. And more I'm thinking of myself as almost like a radical community arts organizer. As this conference grows, it's been now moving across the United States. The plan is to have 3 different hubs for the conference. I'm interested in that because I think it'll be a really great way to build networks of support for artists who are doing this kind of work. I think that there are a lot of conversations, dialogues, those sorts of things are happening, but I'm really trying to figure out how is it that we can support these artists doing this kind of work. And by building up these networks, I think that that's one way to do it. So, tonight, we're excited to be here with you, and I'm assuming that you're all here because you have something to say about socially engaged art as well. You're interested, you're invested, and so we're going to make sure that you're involved in this conversation throughout the evening, too. So the format is going to be that this is like the Jen and Diane show. Bear with us. It's our first time. We're going to take it on the road, though. Okay, so the format is going to be that we're each going to share some projects around socially engaged art, and then we're going to share a question. It's going to start off, I'll talk about a project, I'll pose the question, and Diane has prepared her response in the form of sharing another project. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to the floor after each of those segments, and there's going to be a 3-minute round, a 2-minute round, and a 1-minute round, and you will be timed. In the 3-minute round, someone in the audience will have the chance to respond to the same question. Same thing for the 2-minute round. And then the 1-minute round, we're going to have you all bank questions. Just share questions. We're going to take stock of them, and at the end, we're going to go back to those questions. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay. All right. Flying by the seat of our pants, or calf cans. Okay. The first project that I want to talk about is called Time de Vista. It's by Jose Antonio Vega Mccurley, and he's an artist that lives and works between Amsterdam and also Mexico City. He's an artist that's really interested in systems of time and exchange. And for the past 5 years, he's been doing collaborative projects based in, well, now only one prison in Mexico City. He was at a certain point also doing work at a women's prison, but stopped that, where he will work with a prisoner, and they will make a request for him to do something out in the world that they are not able to do themselves. And based on the amount of time that he will be doing that activity, Jose then asks the inmate to do an activity, sometimes related, not always related, for the exact same set amount of time during the time frame that he's also engaged in the activity. And the activities that Jose has done in the world have ranged from throwing a birthday party for someone's mother, to visiting someone's child, to more explicit requests around someone's girlfriend. I mean, a lot of different sorts of things. So here are a few examples of the asks that he would then make of the prisoners. So for this individual, he asked that for the, I think it might have been 3 hours of his activity, that he document every scar on his body and write the story of that scar, and then document it. This is another inmate, and for this one, what he had him do, it might be a little bit hard to see, those are all noses. He asked that he document every breath for the time span, and this is how he chose to do it. And then the next one is a collage of cigarette butts. So the question I'm asking here is, does socially engaged art have a responsibility that other forms of artistic practice do not?
Okay, so I also wanted to thank very much the Power Plant, Christine and Gaetan and Sarah for having us. It's so fun to meet Jen here and to have an opportunity to talk about this work. Of course, in my mind, socially engaged art has a responsibility. When you work with people, I think in no matter what context you're working with people, we are considerate to their interests in a project we're making, to their motivations for participating, which may not be the same interests and motivations we have. I think as a practitioner, these are questions I'm asking myself all the time. Is what I'm asking of other people in a project less than or at least the same as what they are going to get out of it? When I hear this question, it almost makes me want to ask it in a different way, and that is, I wonder why artists who use other media are not held to account of the way that other people are involved in the making of their materials, of their objects, in displaying their work. Why aren't they held to as much account and questioning about how people are treated as artists who put those social engagements right in the forefront? I wonder about that. But I'm going to show a piece that makes me also think about this question in another way. Let's see if I can advance the slide. So I'm all in favor of being considerate of the people that we work with, but this doesn't preclude making people uncomfortable, whether they're performers or people in the audience. And of course, there's consent to negotiate. I certainly wouldn't approve of a work that held people against their will. I'm sure artists have tried to do that. But certainly I don't think that all socially engaged works should make everyone feel good, and we should all come out of it, happier and healed, etc. So as part of this presentation, I decided to show some local works. So these are, the works I'm showing are all by Toronto artists. They may be projects you've read about or participated in the last few years. This is a very recent work just from a few months ago at Halloween. It's Alison Mitchell's Killjoy's Castle, a lesbian feminist haunted house. And so what Alison Mitchell was doing in collaboration with many, many, many other artists, activists, academics, members of various communities, like among them, and it's important to mention artists like Hazel Meyer, Deirdre Logue, Christina Ziedler, Jess Dobkin, Amy Lockhart, Fastrooms, and many, many, many more. She was appropriating this form of evangelical hell houses. This is something that was new to me. Apparently, every Halloween since the 1970s, evangelical groups all over the United States and Canada have been building these haunted houses that showcase the kind of gruesome things that will happen to you if you engage in things like homosexual relationships and polygamy and abortion and things like that. So what Alison Mitchell has done is she's created her own haunted house, and it's and these are the demented women's studies professors who will take you around this lesbian feminist haunted house. And when you walk in, the demented women's studies professors decide to give you a tour. They're quite scary as you walk through the house. These are the ball-busting butches. They smash truck nuts cast in plaster, those dreadful things at the back of cars. So they're smashing truck nuts. There are all kinds of rooms in this haunted house. From some of the promotional material, it was described as rug-hooked, crocheted, and paper-mache'd constructions are womb-like wonders for visitations of the undead lesbian community who are hell-bent on remaining nightmarishly non-assimilated, casting the spells of freaky feminist skill-sharing and paranormal consciousness-raising together with ghouls, bioengineered monsters, indoctrinators, avengers. The house is designed to pervert, not convert. And so some of these were these perverted grannies, and there were all these gravestones for old theoretical ideas, gender binary, you were too small for this world. I love this. This is a piece by my colleagues who are witches, Fastworms, which is Kim Causey and Di Skews, and they were apparently urinating, or in some texts I read about this, that they were drinking the sperm of witches. you could have a cocktail with witch sperm in it. I actually went through a lot of images before I picked this, and left out a lot because some of it upset and disturbed and scared me too much. I wasn't sure how far I could go even in this presentation, and this project did have the kind of unique effect in the city, which artworks like this sometimes do, and that is that it managed to alienate and anger people on all ends of the political spectrum. So reviews were not always so favorable of this artwork. In some cases, they were actually vitriolic and mean. A Facebook kind of flaming was going on, and it was accused of misrepresenting or failing to represent every kind of feminist or every kind of gender expression, or of being too man-hating, or of being too white, of excluding misogynists, and literally of excluding non-craftivists. Imagine, despite all kinds of evidence, if you look closely at the piece, in my mind, to the contrary. So it sort of polarized every community that it engaged with, activists and academics and artists and people in the neighborhood and queer and trans communities, and left and right wing media. The taxpayer card was played, etc. And of course, this was Halloween, right? Like, this was fun. This was funny. It was satire, and it was over the top, and very much about sort of resisting this stereotype as feminists not having a sense of humor. Actually, Alison Cooley in Canadian Art wrote, it deals with the very real anxiety of entering into the vital yet fraught territory of feminism, and she describes the immense potential of the project, which successfully manages at once to satirize those evangelical scare tactics and homophobic stereotypes, and to provide a sense of the systems of exclusion which operate within radical communities. A very sophisticated, subtle project that managed to make almost everyone angry, antagonize all kinds of people, and it was Halloween. So I'll pass it on to you.
All right. Well, I'm going to pass it on to all of you now.
Okay. Oh, right.
3-minute round.
She's policing this, so.
I'm going to pull up my timer. When you hear the duck quack, if you are the speaker, that means your time is up. The duck is a strong enforcer and will cut you off. So 3 minutes. Anyone in the crowd want to respond to the same question? Does socially engaged art have a responsibility that other forms of art don't? Feel free to reference these projects, maybe other examples that you'd like to share with us that you think might illustrate. And if not, we will sit in 3 minutes of meditation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I guess my question is a question. It's just going to go back. Is morality? So does socially engaged art have a moral compass? Like, does it have to follow a line? I was thinking of the one piece, I think it was in South America, where the artist asked 5 or 6 people to tattoo a line down their back.
Santiago Sierra.
Thinking about capitalism. I'm sorry, what's the artist's name?
Santiago Sierra.
Yeah, so in that one, it kind of jumps between this boundary of morality. So I was kind of interested in exploring that too.
Are we allowed to reply in that or no?
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
Can you reply?
Do you want to talk about ethics is a big thing, and you already started talking about it, Diane, that when you're working with people, it's very different. It's not just like another type of material. You really do have to consider the lived implications of the work existing in the world, how people are using it, how they're impacted by it. I think, to talk about the context we're in right now with Sanatorium, how are people using that? What are the ramifications? Are people actually feeling like it's going to be a really beneficial form of therapy for them, even with an artist disclaimer?
Yeah, for me, an artist like Santiago Sierra, who often he's essentially reproducing some of the already existing circumstances, how people are marginalized and exploited in a city. So what he's doing, in my mind, is making visible something that is just sort of implicit and hidden in everybody else's work and in everybody else's life, right? Which takes me back to that initial thought I had, like, why isn't everyone else being asked to be considerate of the people involved in every part of the process of producing an artwork?
Yeah, I will say that something that always gets me about socially engaged art for the majority is that even though you say that, not many people credit all of the individuals that are involved in producing these projects, and there are models that exist in the world. I mean, look at film, roll credits, even people who are doing food services get a line. So why not, when there are these projects that are about sort of either bringing people together or exposing different sorts of ways of working or communities, I'm not exactly sure why they're not being credited. Volunteer labor in terms of sort of ethics or morality, I mean, Sanatorium, that's primarily run by volunteers. Creative Time did this big project with Suzanne Lacey recently, and she actually came under a lot of fire for, one, the volunteer labor, but then also not providing childcare for the women who were participating in this project. It was all about women having conversations on stoops about feminism today. And it just felt like this incredibly non-feminist gesture to not even consider the fact, well, who's able to participate when you set up this sort of structure?
Thank you.
All right, so we have a 2-minute round now. Someone can either keep that conversation going if they're interested, or respond to the original question of, does socially engaged art have a responsibility that other forms of art do not? All right, thank you.
Well, I don't agree with Diane's proposition that other forms of art aren't required to have an ethical basis. It's everything from, let's say, in printmaking, there's more social or ecological responsibility. Printmakers are trying to find materials that aren't as damaging to the environment. There's a lot of questions around appropriation, even in something like painting, and so we're all called into question. But as soon as you are working with other human beings, the ethical questions come into play a lot more. So.
Oh, I would totally agree. Artists are always asking these questions about, the choices of materials and how they make works. I guess the kind of controversy around Alison Mitchell's piece, for example, I've never seen that kind of expectation of representing everyone, going so far for like a painting or an object-based work, because all the people involved in the object-based works are not in the foreground the way they are in more collaborative, socially engaged art. That's all I mean. It's just not, the standards are somehow just higher, or the kind of questions are just deeper and bigger and more urgent.
I guess it's because a piece is more pressing, kind of thing, and
it was provocative.
It's a provocative piece,
yeah.
So immediately, I think too that people feel guilty and they turn that back on the maker a lot of times.
Yeah, I think they're disturbed by the piece, they're rattled, and so it comes back with
some of the comments
money.
sounded totally absurd to me.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You've listed. But.
Yeah. So
9 seconds left. Okay, we're going to move into the lightning round now.
Okay, 1 minute.
1 minute. Does anyone want to throw some questions into the question bank?
And I'm just going to write it down.
Doesn't have to be a long statement. Diane is
We're not going to answer it.
Taking dictation. We're not answering them right now. We're just saving them for raucous conversation later. So, oh, good. I've got plenty. 2.
Question?
Question. Throw it out there.
Diane said something earlier. You stumbled upon one of the words. You said artivist, which I think is a really good word.
It could be.
So I was wondering the role of the artist when you do this type of work, of socially engaged work. Do you feel like it leans more towards activism or social practice, or you consider it as a social practitioner?
Great question.
And the responsibility also of an impact on from this type of work, I guess.
Thanks.
I just love that word. You should coin it.
It's yours.
I think it might just one more.
Hi, my question would be, how can we encourage cultural institutions to support long-form engagements with the communities that we work with in socially engaged art?
Good question, and I'm actually going to start addressing that in the next example that I'm going to share. Okay. Oh, look, I was so prepared, and then just had it down. Okay. All right, so I want to talk about Tania Bruguera, an artist who lives and works between New York City and also Havana, Cuba. And I'm going to talk about Immigrant Movement International and also her idea of arte utile, or useful art. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Tania. She says, "I don't want an art that points to a thing. I want an art that is the thing." And Useful Art and Immigrant Movement International are really 2 projects in which she's exploring that in very deep ways. And in terms of the question about long form and duration, one of the things that I respect most about the Immigrant Movement International project is that when Tania brought this idea to Creative Time and to the Queen's Museum, she just right out let them know that this is not a short form project. That if you are committing to a minimum of 5 years, and this is my expectation. And so this is her own language, how she describes it, that the conception year was 2006, the implementation years, they will run from 2010 to 2015. The medium is appropriation of political strategies and useful art. Duration, it is a long-term project. Materials, she considers them to be immigration policies and law, immigrant populations, elected officials, politicians, community organizations, public pressure, media. And whether or not it's really clear in there, it's also the community of users in Corona, Queens who really run the space. And then the location is, of course, as I just stated, Corona, Queens. So the other interesting thing about where this project is at right now is that Tania's also trying to figure out how can it be, and this kind of gets to that question of the role of the artist, how can it be that maybe an artist operates more as an instigator or initiator, and then when can the artist leave? And so she has been actually, for the whole duration, she's been living upstairs from Immigrant Movement. So this is their storefront space in Queens. It's about a 10-minute walk from the Queens Museum. And part of the thing that Immigrant Movement does is it's community run, it's community operated. They provide legal services for immigrant communities. They also provide employment opportunities. All sorts of like community center based activities also go on within that space. And Tanya has been trying to distance herself from the project a little bit, which is difficult when you physically live above it. And so there's always this kind of asking or making sure things are going smoothly. And she really wants the usership to have more agency. So she's in this sort of transitional process right now. And she has a pretty good website for the project, and they give a year-by-year statement. Part of how the community has agency in the project is they write the mission statement together. It was not formed when Immigrant Movement started, as you know, she just initiated it, and then together the board that sort of formed around it of community members wrote the language together and what their sort of guiding principles would be. And then for useful art, she's done a lot of workshops at the Queen's Museum around what is useful art. It's a question that comes up at Immigrant Movement a lot. And she's also doing a large project right now at the Van Abbey Museum where she's repurposed one of their old buildings, and it's become this sort of research lab where a handful of people around the world are putting in sort of case studies of what they have deemed useful art. So right now there's an archive of over 200 projects. But for her, for a project to be useful, they must, 1, propose new uses for art within society, 2, challenge the field within which it operates, whether that's civic, legislative, pedagogical, scientific, economic, etc. 3, be timing specific, responding to current urgencies. 4, be implemented and function in real situations. 5, replace authors with initiators and spectators with users. 6, have practical, beneficial outcomes for its users. 7, pursue sustainability whilst adapting to changing conditions. And lastly, reestablish aesthetics as a system of transformation. I wanted to say too that even though the question I'm going to ask is, should art be useful? That's coming right up. But what's kind of refreshing is that Nato Thompson, a curator at Creative Time, has said that what he thinks is actually really interesting is the question has changed from, is it art? I think a lot of people would ask this question before, but he's really noting that people are now asking, well, is it useful? Here's another quote from Tanya. I've always said that we have to put Duchamp's urinal back in the restroom. Now that urinal is in the restroom at the Queen's Museum. You can see it and you can pee on it. So should art be useful?
It's a good question. And certainly, I think one may associate often with socially engaged practices that it is kind of instrumentally useful, and often, many artists engaged with working with marginal people in various contexts, like the first 2 projects you showed. For me, I would dare to say art should be useful. I'll make a blanket rule, but for me, use is perhaps much broader when I answer that question for myself in my own work and in the works of some of the artists I admire. So this is a project many locally may know of by Mammalian Diving Reflex, which is of course the artistic director, Darren O'Donnell, Haircuts by Children, which started in 2006 and is toured, if I'm reading their site properly, to nearly 30 cities as the work of this theater production company. And so this piece involved teaching 8 to 10-year-olds how to cut hair. They were taught in a salon in the Parkdale neighborhood in the first iteration, and they were actually paid to cut hair in the salon, and adults, anyone, could go and get a free haircut by a child. I actually had a chance to experience this, and it was really, really moving. I didn't entirely expect what it would be like. I was nervous about the haircut, which wasn't that good, but the use of this project is not the haircut, right? The use of a project like this was all of these experiences that I was having, as well as the kids were having, and this unusual reversal of the hierarchy among children and adults. I was in the chair, sort of vulnerable, and this 8-year-old boy whose family had just immigrated from Sri Lanka was cutting my hair, and we lived in the same neighborhood. the fact that this kid, who I might otherwise never have a chance to meet, was, touching my head, the kind of quality of this intimacy and of this exchange for 20 minutes was really extraordinary. In Darren's writing about the works, in his usual sort of bombastic, aspirational style, he says that this is a performance about the future. He says, in the future, every child will be given a pair of scissors and invited to shape our destinies. In the future, every child will be granted full citizenship rights, encouraged to vote, run for office, and drive streetcars. In the future, children will teach and adults will learn. A playground will be built on every battlefield, and candy will be free. In the future, children will be powerful creatures, able to cross the street without looking both ways and hold their breath underwater forever and ever and ever. This is the same company that produced several other provocative projects, including a piece called "Allow Me the Honor of Relaxing You," which was actually at the Open Engagement Conference in 2007. Perhaps you could talk about it better, but this was where, in collaboration with the First Nations University in Regina, Darren organized an opportunity for the participants of the conference and the students and staff, to offer massages to the students and staff of the First Nations University. And in his terms, he said, the piece was about a gentle acknowledgement about how in our society stress and relaxation are unevenly distributed, and this was an attempt to redistribute tranquility, which is an uncommon use. I'll show you a couple of other haircuts. a lot of brave adults. Another piece, a use you didn't know you needed, but he provided a work called Slow Dance with Teacher, which was performed in Toronto for Nuit Blanche in 2010 at Hart House under Barbara Fisher's night school projects. And this was Slow Dance with Teacher. He solicited a whole bunch of professors and grade school teachers and high school teachers, and they were available for slow dancing. So there was a DJ and a ballroom and a disco ball, and the public could dance with a teacher and realize a fantasy, perhaps, that they may have had, a gym teacher, math professor or something like that. And for me, these are unique needs and dreams and uses for artworks. Not all artworks must be acts of kind of amateur social work or activism, although those are worthwhile and very exciting projects in many ways because artists bring new strategies to these kinds of activities. But there's a lot of other work to do and things that artists are particularly good at, making meaning, creating opportunities for conversations, beauty and pleasure, doing the work of poets, so doing the work of consolation, of reflection, all kinds of things. Also making messes, making nonsense, work like Alison Mitchell's, creating an uproar. All of these are useful endeavors, I think, and grateful for this kind of diverse range among socially engaged practices.
Right. All right.
So, Jen?
Turning it over again. Got a 3-minute round on the table where someone can respond to the question, should art be useful?
You didn't know how much work you'd have to do when you showed up.
I know people must have an opinion about this. Thank you.
I guess I would like to know or question what the idea of what useful art is, because having maybe just a purely aesthetic experience in front of something could be considered very useful or uplifting. So something that isn't maybe socially engaged could still be useful in terms of like pleasure or maybe an intellectual exercise. So, and if it fails to do that, then it would probably be considered bad art. So maybe on some level that what we understand as good art or bad art is based on how we find it useful, but there's a plethora of ways that something could be useful.
Yeah.
It's my 2 cents that did not take up 3 minutes.
Well, there's more time. I definitely agree with you, and that's why I shared Tanya's very clear outline of, for her, what makes art useful in society right now. What are the sort of urgent things that artists can address and sort of change? And that goes to sort of, maybe that is part of the role of the artist today. There's a great book out that Alain de Botton and John Armstrong wrote called Artist Therapy, that if you haven't looked at it, I think you'd really like it, because it talks a lot about how art, even very traditional forms of art, the way we see it in most galleries, can be useful in all these other ways that we're maybe not thinking about, and they're not socially engaged forms. I don't think, for me, it's at all about a paradigm shift, right, where you have to do this kind of work for it to be useful, but I think it is worthwhile to make a claim and take a stance, and I think Tanya is an artist who's definitely done that. Thank you.
I guess one thing that I was thinking is that yes, art should be useful. It should have a function, but maybe on the other hand, sometimes it shouldn't be useful, because I think you can get into the trap of being like, okay, now art has this specific role in society, and I think that the real beauty of working like as an artist or as a poet is that you can try and break out of these rules that we make for ourselves, and so yeah.
Great.
I'm a big fan of the use of nonsense, of making messes, of I mean, it depends on how you interpret use, but of passing the time, of disagreeing, of upsetting assumptions. I mean, there's all kinds of work an artwork does in every form, of just making something orderly temporarily, offering some respite from something else. I mean, there's so many possibilities, and it's not something perhaps everyone agrees with. But
All right, 2-minute round. Any statements on art and if it should be useful? Thank you.
I wonder if one should even make that statement, what art should be, because that puts it under a construction and it's a label, and that's what we're trying as artists to be free, creative investigators, and to put a paradigm or a quotation, this is what it should be, automatically for someone who's done a lot of social practice, I wouldn't be interested in that. I would say, let's not do that. Let's leave it open-ended, because the minute you put a confinement to it with a label, then you're structuring it to your own intention. And whoever is the author, you have to read what they say or listen to what they say and see what their intention is, and then make your own decision.
in my mind, there's a good use to ambiguity, to the slippery, to the indecision, to flirting with everything at once. That's useful.
Oh, okay. Question over there. At the back.
Yeah, I'm kind of having trouble thinking of an artwork that's not useful.
Maybe
basically.
I am too.
I just keep going down the list of, well, the work is serving something and we may not see what it is, and that relationship, the social relationship may be between the seen and the unseen, or between it may be, the artwork may be a gift for someone who's no longer living. I just can't, I'm really having trouble even identifying an artwork that's not useful. So it's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, and I think when you are approaching it in that very broad way that's not Tanya's definition of useful art, then yeah, I agree with you. And it's sort of similar to the argument that a lot of people make, which is, well, isn't all art socially engaged? And Pablo Helguera, I think, put it very succinctly in his book, Education for Socially Engaged Art, when he said there's a difference between art that goes into the world and we have these engagements with them versus art that is created through some kind of social intercourse, that the being social was integral to its being in the world. And that's really the difference between socially engaged work and just art serving a social function. All right, lightning round. Let's bank some questions.
I'm writing them down.
All right.
I have a question around usefulness, but it's more of a statement because I wanted to speak in the last round.
Has to be a question.
Essentially, I think it's really important to identify the difference between speaking of usefulness in terms of social urgency, in terms of how an artwork would serve a social movement, for example, versus the experience of being alive and being part of culture, which makes everything useful, you know, when you reflect on it. So I could form that into a question, but I actually just wanted to make that statement.
How about something like, can we distinguish?
Oh, we've got a question back there.
Hi. I was wondering, this is something I've seen a lot from artists who often get classified as socially engaged artists, and that is listing people or like types of people under materials.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could talk about that.
Oh yeah, let's bank that. That can be problematic. All right, so we'll move on.
So the way Jen has this organized is that these little questions will come up at the end, and we'll all have a chance to return to them. That's why I'm writing them down.
Question bank. Sorry if that was unclear.
Question bank, yeah. That's what she calls it.
So it's moving. Okay, so the next project I want to talk about was a year-long residency that Machine Projects, which is an LA-based collective run by Mark Allen, did at the Hammer Museum. So the Hammer Museum of Art is one of the first museums in the US with a public engagement department. Pretty new. This was their inaugural year. And the year before this residency started, Machine Projects did this big event at LACMA, in which they really rethought what kinds of events could happen in a museum. Parts of it were like a go-kart race. There were artists reproducing paintings as like large-scale floral arrangements in the gallery. There was this heavy metal, like a Slayer kind of guitar guy who every hour on the hour, because they have like a bell tower, would go up and like just shred to mark the time. There's a lot of projects that involve music. So when they started this public engagement program, I think one of the reasons that it really started was, one, the Hammer has this really great way of including artists in their process overall. Artists are on the board, and so they're able to have input on a lot of the different structural elements and goings-ons at the museum. And I think one question that is still yet resolved, or many people have different takes on it, is, well, what does the museum actually mean by public engagement? And why do they want to bring artists in this way? So a lot of the people on the board had identified several problems at the institution. And they thought, oh, you know, it would be great to bring artists on as problem solvers and to look at it through the lens of an artist. And one of the issues was wayfinding. And so Mark Allen and Machine Projects did address that issue throughout the year, but I think in a way that no one on the board had hoped. They wanted problems solved. They didn't want problems made bigger. But I think artists like to problematize, and when we work with problems, it's not necessarily to solve them, but maybe to use that artist lens and make things messier or draw attention or whatever it might be. And so the solution was they created this giant hand that's in the foyer of the building that houses the Hammer Museum and houses offices and all these other things. So it's a pretty complicated building. And so you would stand in front of this giant hand, and there were all these different buttons that you would press where it is you want to go in the museum. And then this giant hand would just turn and sort of point vaguely in the direction of where you might go. And it really didn't solve a problem. It just actually pointed out that they were failing. in a lot of ways. So I think that was an unanticipated event. I'll say a few things too about this. It was really large scale budget. They got most of it from the Irvine Foundation, over $100,000. The budget for just machine projects doing their work with other artists. They worked with over 200 artists over the course of the year, and then they did over 36 projects. So for anyone that works in programming, that's kind of bonkers for just one small area that was brand new to take that on. So they learned a lot. Okay, here's another project that they took on, and this was just simply thinking about how the public spaces of the museum are used. There's this courtyard that kind of connects a bunch of the different areas, and they just decided they were going to put a ping pong table there. While it's a project that doesn't really, I think, have a lot of depth, there's not really anything going on there, let's be honest. Something that it did problem solve at the museum was, well, how can we use the space differently? And while that might have not really been that successful as a project, now they're doing all sorts of other kinds of programming there. I was just in LA for the Made in LA Biennial, and one of the things they did was they worked with this dance studio, James Kidd Dance Studio, and the courtyard is just this outdoor stage now that they're programming the whole time, and they've just realized, like, oh, this is an exciting space that was overlooked. And then I think what I want to do now is we're going to transition over, and I'm going to show a clip of some of the uses of this one space, another overlooked space at the Hammer. It was their coat check. They turned it into, well, you'll see many of the uses for the coat check. It became this micro theater where like up to 3 people could see concerts. People did wine tasting and like cheese tasting in there. It was like all sorts of bizarre things were happening in this space that wasn't being programmed before. Other things that they did at the museum too, like the whole tone of their residency is very fun. You know, it's just things like they had a sleep-in and a nap-in for people who couldn't make it to the sleep-in, in which like they were like trying to talk about dreams, and there was like this whole paleo skill set thing that they did. There was like a tour, like if you had to survive in LA as like a caveman, what skills would you need? They did this houseplant vacation where people could drop off their houseplants and have vacations at the Hammer for 2 weeks, and they like did programming for the plants. So, I mean, these are things that are not like solving immigration issues, right? Like, this might not be very useful. Anyhow, we're going to show a video now in just a moment. Perfect.
Show a movie on your cheek.
This is the St. Pat made by the Calgary Creamery. Organic cow's milk.
Okay.
To the bar and said, "Hi, Steve. What's the bad word today?"
May I cover your heads? Sure.
G. Douglas Barrett. And Doug was an American, and I think it's a Cowboys. He's living in Berlin now, and he's in this coat room.
And that was only the programming that happened in that closet. Like they did so much more. So that takes me to my question, and that is socially engaged art being instrumentalized? And I mean, you can answer that broadly. I mean, we were having a little conversation earlier about something like Sanatorium. I think some people have this fear that socially engaged art could be used to maybe supplement social services in actually a very real way. But with something like machine projects, I think that, what was the role that they hoped that they would fulfill at the institution? They really wanted problems solved, and that's not what they got. Or I work with the Portland Art Museum, and we do very similar kinds of programming, and I think that part of what they want is to develop new audiences, because they are very aware that their current audience is departing. So I'll hand it over.
Departing. I'm just trying to figure out what you mean. Socially engaged art is being instrumentalized from my point of view. I know from working this way that socially engaged practices, at least in Canada that I'm familiar with, are often not so much curated as hosted by education departments and public engagement departments wanting to expand audiences, have more audience interaction, part of an educational project. And very often artists who do any kind of performatic, live, sociable artworks are asked to entertain at parties. Party art is what some of us are starting to call it. This is Amy Lamb and John Mccurley, who together are the collective known as Life of a Craphead. What a name. And this was one of the funniest pieces I have ever seen. I've been talking a lot with other artists who work in performance, like how they deal with these party art invitations, where your imperatives are to some extent, decorate, entertain, flatter patrons to the museums, and contribute to a fun party that people will, I guess, tweet about and Instagram about and have a great time at. And this is a very unique set of constraints that limit what artists do and how they can express their ideas, having to, as I think of it, entertain at parties. In my own work, I've been trying to solve that problem with each attempt, but this was one of the best examples I'd ever seen. Life of a Craphead at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Sometimes at the Art Gallery of Ontario, you'll walk in and there'll be a naked person, a naked lady, and there'll be one of these kind of art school life drawing sessions going on. And I was kind of surprised they still do that kind of thing. And what Amy and John did was they appropriated this form. They even took out all the drawing courses and the paper and the platform and all of these absurd props like a conch shell and an amphora and things like that, and the drapery. And they posed nude. This was throughout a First Thursday event, which is a big sort of splashy party at the AGO where people carry cocktails around the gallery. And this piece was called Nude with a Microphone. And so you could draw these nudes, but they weren't just sort of static, objects without identities. They were sort of rambling on about boring, sort of mundane, everyday things and about their lives, like nude, like talking into the microphones. It was the strangest, funniest scenario, because I could not believe how many people were seriously focused on the task of drawing them while they were doing this kind of banal stand-up comedy the entire time. I think it was 5 hours long. And people were really drawing them, and but they were refusing to kind of be just objects, right? They were people with like idiosyncrasies and things like that. It makes me think of a former professor of mine and artist who I respect and admire very much, Giselle Mantea, told me once she was given the task to teach an introductory drawing course where every year you always have to have these naked ladies come and do the life drawing, and it made her so uncomfortable that she couldn't bear it, and she hired instead an Elvis impersonator, and all of her students drew an Elvis impersonator. Such a clever solution, because it really passed as part of a First Thursday kind of experience, but it was so critical at the same time. And that's something that I think when artists are being asked to solve problems at museums or problems in cities or trying to be instrumentalized in some ways, I'm really excited about artists who find ways to sort of pass but intervene and be critical at the same time, like to make things that just can't be so easily consumed. I think in terms of the Power Plant and the Powerball every year, Jess Dobkin does these uninvited performances. Some of you may have seen. She's not one of the commissioned artists. She does a kind of guerrilla performance. And in 2010, I think it was, she did a piece where she wore a sort of chic little white dress, looked past as like one of the regular kind of stylish partygoers, except she had like a very convincing like dribble of menstrual blood down the back of her dress, and was like socializing and glamorous, and it was so unnerving. And she did another piece, I think the following year in 2011, some of you may know about, where she advertised and apparently performed blowjobs in the bathroom of the power plant for $100. And that was her intervention into these kinds of party art scenarios. So amazing. That was Jess Dobkin. And so, okay, we'll just go on to...
Okay, this is the last round. We're going to start 3 minutes. Does anyone have thoughts on, is this work being instrumentalized? Should it be?
Is that always bad?
Is it bad? Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't think that it should be necessarily, but I think that there's some really interesting projects that come out of kind of the instrumentalization. So like Sanatorium, I think, is a pretty obvious example of it, but another piece that Pedro Reyes did was Palas por Pistolas, and that was one of my favorite kind of socially engaged projects, where they went to this, I can't remember the name of the town in Mexico, but it was like a really like violence ravaged town where the drug trade was really prominent, and they took pistols and turned them into shovels. So they would take these pistols and trade them with the people for like food stamps, and then the shovels were turned into, or the pistols were turned into shovels, and then the shovels were used to plant trees. And I thought it was kind of this really nice, like, social project. And yeah, I think it's a pretty good example of instrumentalizing it, but making it like really poetic at the same time. So it's not like a 1 + 1 = 2 thing. It's more than that, I guess. But yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask about was, what level of participation do you think is required before it's considered socially engaged work? So like participation or cooperation or partnership, like what kind of level do you think makes it more interesting, I guess?
Just a note about the Pedro Reyes piece. So one thing is that it wasn't food stamps that he was trading for. It was these coupons for free electronics. And I can't remember the name of the city for the life of me either right now. But the other thing too is it definitely didn't solve any problems. I think they did a tally of how many guns were estimated to be in that one particular place, and it was like over 20,000, something ridiculous. And they were able to collect maybe like 2,000 guns at the most. And so it was really about just drawing attention to, I think, that issue, but definitely not solving it. And then, in my opinion, for your question, that is defined by each artist with the context of each project. And there's not like some sort of rule book about like, okay, well, it needs to have this many people to qualify. I think that those are all things determined by the artist and the context of the project. Thoughts? 17 seconds.
We can go to the 2 minutes.
All right, we're moving on to the 2-minute round now. Any thoughts? 2 minutes of meditation? I'm kidding. Well, we can move on to banking questions. Okay. This is the last chance to bank questions then. We've exhausted you guys. All right.
Well, maybe I'll write Paul's question about what counts as socially engaged. Like how many people in what by what terms? Is that what you mean? Yeah. So, okay. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
I missed the first part. The streets of Toronto defeated me, and I ended up in the wrong place and everything else, but so I was late. But so this might have been covered, but is relationalism the same thing as social engagement, or is socially engaged art? Was it covered?
No.
Any last burning questions for the question pile?
Yes. All right. How are we for time?
We have 24 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So when we were invited among the organizers, and Jen and myself, we thought we would show a few artists' works as well as some of our own work. Jen's work with the Open Engagement Conference, and I thought I would show, relative to the discussion we've just had about institutions and instrumentalization, 2 works that I made as the artist in residence at the Art Gallery of Ontario in the fall in 2013. And this is a very unique and, in many ways, wonderful position at the Art Gallery of Ontario. It's run, again, not by the curatorial department, but by the education department in the basement of the gallery. And I think something I did wanted to follow up on the instrumentalized conversation was that is one of the hazards of these works being, these works are not supported by the same trappings as the works inside the museum upstairs, on the white walls with big didactic panels, etc. These kinds of works are not well documented. There's not a lot of really great books, documenting a history of these kinds of works, here in Toronto and Canada, even internationally. They're kind of marginal to the real art all the time, especially when it's at parties or, downstairs or part of an educational event, and that's really a problem. I know that many people have had many of these critiques about Nuit Blanche in general, that it's an instrumental project to, have a creative city and generate tourism and satisfy a lot of problems and needs. This was a project, Your Temper, My Weather, that I made for Nuit Blanche at the Art Gallery of Ontario under the education wing downstairs. And it was a piece that was a kind of culmination of many years of involvement in beekeeping organizations and communities and practicing beekeeping that I did for many years. And so for this piece, it was in Walker Court, which I really insisted on, and I was so grateful for those incredible women working in education like Paola Poletto at the AGO, who diplomatically maneuvered this and got me out of the basement into this most spectacular, grand space of the museum. And what I did was I had 100 beekeepers, sounds easy, just got 100 beekeepers to come to Walker Court and essentially sit still for 5 hours. And we were led by a couple of mindfulness meditation instructors just to sit quietly and to be attuned and present in the moment, just present there together, 100 of us, for the duration of a Nuit Blanche. For this piece, a lot of socially engaged projects have a lot to do with generating conversations, and that's very important. I was kind of curious about the effect of a whole bunch of other things that happen when people come together. Beekeeping is a very unique and specific kind of activity. These people consisted of people who teach beekeeping, like amateur beekeepers, some commercial beekeepers, people who remove hives from your walls for a living, students of beekeeping, and scientists, activists, as well as people who wrote to me begging to be part of it. They love bees so much. They paint them and attract bees to their gardens. And so I wondered about what I learned from beekeeping, this kind of particular temper and attunement and presence and calm and gentleness. I wondered about the sort of power and effect of that, and if I amplified it by 100 people in this spectacular space for a significant duration, what we could produce with that temper, with that position, with that way of being. And so that's what we did. And we just, we hummed and sat quietly. We also did some walking meditation in the museum. And it was for 5 hours during Nuit Blanche. I was so excited to get to do this piece. It was, like, for me, the most ambitious and large-scale piece I'd ever made. And it was only because I had the support of the AGO that I would have dared to attempt it. I could contact and talk to people who were not performance artists, virtually none of them. And the AGO gives so much credibility and legitimacy to the whole thing. Nuit Blanche, that institutional support in various ways, really helped, essentially made this piece possible, which I was very grateful for. And then on the other hand, I made this very, very tiny piece, and that was we drank tea. So, I worked for many months preceding the Your Temper, My Weather to get all of those people together for this kind of spectacular gesture. And right at the beginning of my residency, it was explained to me that they want artists, in the museum to challenge them, to, solve problems, to show us how artists have unique strategies and ideas and abilities and can teach us to do things differently. I was really excited about my kind of backroom access and the relationships and the knowledge of all of the people working in the museum, which were quite impressive. And I asked right at the beginning if we could use an artifact, if we could, simply drink tea out of a teacup in the collection. And this was at first, everyone said no. And it was for a good month or so. The joke was it was the most impossible cup of tea, in the country that I was trying to have. And after, again, negotiating and spectacular diplomatic skills on behalf of the people working with me at the museum, we gradually made it to a yes. And I wanted to do this with the complicity of conservators. So the piece is called Tea Service, Conservators Will Wash the Dishes. I loved that they, I didn't have to wash the dishes because they weren't dishes until we were drinking out of them, and then they weren't dishes anymore. They were artifacts. And so we had tea in the conservation lab, which is so wrong, just the privilege to be back there was so extraordinary. And so a group of conservators, an interpretive planner, a registrar, a curator, myself, an art critic. So we had a kind of diverse group of people, different things at stake in this gesture, different concerns, different knowledge about the objects and about the activity. And this was an opportunity to have a conversation, to get to know about a thing by feeling it, by putting it in your mouth, by smelling it, by handling it, by having the responsibility, in your hand, sharing that knowledge and those concerns throughout this entire process. It's a piece that really was 3 months long. So I served very special, clear teas. And before and after the action, the conservators washed the dishes, which was great. So for me, that was a little intervention to kind of, this didn't do anything for audience engagement. I wanted to just stay in the back rooms and see what I could challenge, interrogate, some of the boundaries that are taken for granted that are reasonable, actually. But I think, this is another one of the uses of artists, and that is to go places and do things not everyone can. Sometimes we just need one ambassador. It wouldn't be feasible if we all went around handling artifacts, but it's a privilege we have sometimes as artists to cross some of these boundaries, to do eccentric, outrageous, otherwise crazy activities, and that's a meaningful privilege I like to exploit if I can.
Well, I think that's a great segue into the last portion of the evening, which is talking about some of the questions that y'all brought up for us tonight. And I think the first one was actually about, well, what is the role of the artist? And then I heard someone else say that part of what was important was that artists don't have sort of the same boundaries, and I'm hearing that echoed with what you just said. And we talked a little bit about Dave Hickey at dinner, and Dave Hickey, in his book Pirates and Farmers, said that there are only two types of people in the world. There are pirates and there are farmers, and that farmers build fences and control territory, whereas pirates cross borders and tear down fences. And I think that that is partly what the role of the artist is today, is to cross boundaries.
And it's often upsetting, that's important. But should I read the questions, or did you want to suggest?
I want to stress that this is also open, and at this point, if anyone has anything they'd like to say and jump in the conversation, we have about 10 to 15 minutes left. So,
Abbas, you asked at first whether you said something about activism. Like, is this activism or
artivism?
Do works, are socially engaged works always activist, or how? What did you exactly want to ask?
Oh, the difference is like which direction it leans when you do this type of work. Is it type of activism or social practice in terms of impacting lacking social programs? Because I could think of the example that you brought up, the Tanya Brugger example of the usefulness and this that has this activism aspect, but also the social aspect. And there's a lot of critique about the project that it also backfires because it gave kind of slack or a break from the actual services, and Creative Time kind of took this upon themselves, and they kind of wonder about the sustainability of this. So you would think, like, is this a temporary thing, an activist gesture, or is this something I take upon myself and I continue to be responsible for in terms of effect or, I guess, sustainability of it? Is it a gesture or is it an actual program?
Like, is it symbolic or is it really instrumental?
Yeah, I don't think it's symbolic. It is a real program, and the sustainability is something that's been thought through more than just 5 years, but that is what these organizations have committed to. And I know for a fact that that is something that Tanya is trying to figure out, right? How can it be something that is sustainable? And part of that is having these invested users carry on the space, and the use of it continues to evolve, and support comes in many different forms, and it's something that they're even setting up satellite locations now in other countries and trying to address it as more of a global issue.
I'm thinking for me, I think some works have an explicit kind of activist, in a more, explicit sense than other works. Again, there are always problems to address, large and small and grave things at stake, and, maybe less life or death things at stake. And again, some artists are really good at making imaginative, creative, using artistic strategies at accomplishing activist goals and activist gestures, and some artists are really good at at being amateur anthropologists or being amateur, other kinds of roles that we need. And it's just not always, for me, it's not the only way, certainly, to proceed, but a worthwhile one. And, it's ironic, but some people think as soon as it gets too useful, then it's probably not art, and I wouldn't agree with that. I think, why not? I mean, I just was in Reykjavik in Iceland, where the mayor there, Jan Janar, was a comedian who ran a joke campaign that gradually became a real campaign and actually won and was mayor for 4 years, and apparently was a pretty good mayor with high approval ratings, and he accomplished much good. For me, it was quite a sustained work of performance art as well, and just because he also did a lot of work and worked out financial budgets for a city, it was still an artwork. I mean, there are plenty of examples like that. For me, I mean, again, this is how I'm trained, and this is how I come to understand these activities and make sense of them, and I think the artists who do them have the same kind of point of departure. So,
something I was thinking about when you asked your question is that I try to be very conscious of, okay, when I ask a question of a project that's socially engaged art, how does it sound when I ask it of another type of
that's good.
Approach? And so to take that question to be like, okay, well, is this painting, just a gesture, or is it sustainable? You know what I mean? Like, no one would really ask that of this other type of work. And so what are the qualities of socially engaged art that gives this other kind of responsibility? And there are other questions, too, that feel very much in line with, I guess, do-gooderism, right? Mm-hmm. And there having to be this usefulness to these works that I think should not be imposed. And I think that there can be as many approaches to doing work that is socially engaged as there are artists doing the work, right? Like, we would never expect that, like, oh, well,
right.
You're a sculptor, so that means you're all doing work to make the world a better place. That's just, like, inherent in doing sculpture. It's just everyone's exploring different themes and in different ways.
And the sustainability question always comes up, I think, with any of these kinds of projects, especially when they're social work-like. And it's always a little absurd to me. I know that Harold Fletcher talks about, like, isn't it okay to do a little bit of good? When does it end? I mean, are you responsible to be, like, a good social worker, like, in perpetuity if you make a piece like this, for one moment, one gesture? I mean, maybe that's also where the symbolic trumps the actually accomplishing something.
But I think that question of duration, especially with immigrant movement, also kind of gets to ethics, right? Like, if you're doing something like that, you really are engaged with a population and starting something quite serious. Mm-hmm. And I think that has to be considered, that is a relationship that should be a longer lasting one.
Absolutely, yeah.
Feels like
Depending
there
on,
was another
and when you're working with beekeepers, it's different from when you're working with people who are already, vulnerable and powerless in various ways or discriminated against, marginal.
I have a small question. That's a segue to this question. Is there a role, or have you seen artists that are socially engaged work with NGOs or actual activist organizations? So has that happened, or do you think that there's a role which loops back to the sustainability and the degree of usefulness that you talked about? Like, how much usefulness is there, and how long does it last?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I can't remember the name of the artist, but I sat on a selection committee for A Blade of Grass. They're an organization in New York that funds socially engaged art projects. And these were pretty large fellowships that they were giving out, I think $20,000 fellowships. And one of the projects that was proposed and then actually got accepted was this artist who wanted to work with the Shell Corporation, or something that everyone's like, really? Wow. And then we asked a lot of those questions, like, well, why not work with an organization like this? If you are having these sort of concerns around environmental impact, maybe you can do more if you're partnered in this way. Do you have any examples that you can think of? It's happening now, so
because I think there's
to be determined.
Role, right? It's thinking outside the box. I'm not an artist, so I'm on the other side, and so we bring I mean, some of those examples that you showed, I was like, wow, that's stretching my mind. So artists do bring a different kind of thinking, and they could do that to the business world and you know, the humanitarian world, really.
And artists are, I mean, when we make these works, whether we make them in museums or, you know, in hair salons or at the beach, they're proposing ways of relating to each other. And these strategies of artists have been appropriated in popular culture, in advertising. They're appropriated by activists. They're appropriated by, you know, other spheres of life as well, you know, whether artists are involved or not. Should we look at some of the other questions?
Yeah, it looks like we have time for one more, but there might be someone with a burning question right now.
Yeah.
She's got her hand half up. I feel like we should be present for that
I'm
one.
not sure if this is a question as much as a comment. I was thinking about it's haunting me, your upstairs, downstairs thing that they do, and are we using different criteria to look at the work? But then I noticed Tanya's last comment was reestablishing aesthetics as a system of transformation. So if maybe she's addressing that immediately too. I'm not sure that aesthetics is a different category, but maybe it is, and maybe.
I question myself when I feel frustrated that there's no didactic panel for me, or curatorial essay, or that the glossy catalog, for some of these activities. Is that just an ego thing? Is that just a career issue? Or but I think something else really important is at stake, and that is like a history of these practices, a critical discourse around these practices. Nuit Blanche gets very little critical attention after the fact. There's plenty of little preview one-liners, to seduce everyone to this party night of artworks, and then it kind of disappears. And these are projects people work on all year, massive projects that last 12 hours long, usually with lots of performers, that are really significant, and should be taken up critically and considered as important as the things in the white walls, in the museum. So that is something to consider, and then these works don't fit always very easily or well into the white walls of the museum, for a 2-month show, a 6-month show, with the volunteers working in the Pedro Reyes show. I mean, that's one of the problems. How do you animate a live social piece for 3 or 4 months, right? This is a problem in all kinds of ways. And it's something, maybe one of those good questions that came up before was related to encouraging institutions to support this work and to have longer-term, relationships with communities. There are a lot of sort of practical problems as well.
Yeah, whether you intended it or not, in your comment, the upstairs, downstairs thing made me think very much of like Downton Abbey, and who is the elite and who is doing the drudgery. And I think that gets to what you're saying around these sorts of practices tend to occupy different spaces in museums. There are the overlooked spaces. Like, look at the Walker Arts Center. They have their great open field program, but it's because it happens in a space where curatorial doesn't care about, and that's also where most of these education departments doing a lot of the drudgery. This kind of work is so labor intensive at the Hammer Museum.
And they're not getting enough credit, the education departments who are curators, really. As well. But on the other hand, a lot of sneaky, mischievous stuff can happen when you're in the basement, right? Like, artists can sort of get away with projects that are developed, with much shorter time frame, which can also be annoying. But I mean, you don't have to go through the sort of chain of command the way you would if you're doing something upstairs, for months and months and months. So sometimes the party artworks, important, dangerous, things can happen because they don't go through the same sort of filters and criteria and months of sort of oversight and everything else. There's some advantages to being on the edges in those respects as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also advantages to not being given the normal things that you equate with meaning and value, because that means we get to assign those things ourselves within our own practices and projects, that our goal isn't the glossy catalog, although we love publications, that we can find ways to make meaning in other areas and for other people too. I think that that's also important and something that we probably don't value as much, and why so many of these practices do happen out in the world. But on that note, that takes us to time. I want to thank you all again for being good sports and doing some work with us and conversing tonight. Hope you all had a good time. Thank you. Thank you, Jen. So good to meet you.